Hello, everyone, and thank you for tuning in to our weekly review show where we unpack the biggest stories from Palestine and the region. I am, as always, joined by my regular guest, Mouin Rabbani. Mouin, how are you doing? And thank you for joining us again.
Thank you, Nassim, for having me. It's always a pleasure and hope you're well.
I'm fine, and likewise, yes, it's always a pleasure to have you on the show as well. Again, we'll begin with Gaza. I mean, the situation is beyond anything we can imagine. There was a chilling warning that was issued by the UN saying that 14,000 babies are at risk of dying in the next 48 hours unless aid reaches them. Ceasefire talks in Doha have also stalled. The Qatari Prime Minister has said that there are fundamental differences, and he accused, he the blamed Israel's assault on Gaza, the latest assault on Gaza, as one of the reasons for why the negotiations has stalled. So let's begin with that, I guess, and I'm
Yeah.
referring to what's called Operation Gideon's Chariot. We touched on that briefly last week because Trump was visiting the region, and we had some vague outlines about what that would entail. So, do you want to just go through what this plan is before we discuss some of the
Sure.
other issues?
Yeah. Well, Operation Gideon's Chariots, as the Israelis have called it, is the latest attempt by the Israeli military to achieve what it has consistently failed to achieve since October of 2023, and that is the total victory, much touted by Netanyahu on repeated occasions. I mean, the Israelis have announced either that they've won or that they're on the cusp of victory so many times. But here, yet again, they find that they need to launch another massive military operation to achieve that. But this isn't about achieving a military victory in the conventional sense of defeating your adversary. As the Israelis have stated very clearly, explicitly, on multiple occasions, at the very highest levels, the objective of Gideon's chariots is to literally raze the entire Gaza Strip to the ground, to concentrate the remaining Palestinian population into isolated pockets where the only way that they can receive essential supplies is by going to several hubs that will be operated by US mercenaries acting under the supervision of the Israeli military. These people will have to go there once a week, I think, to receive limited supplies, provided they're properly vetted and all the rest of it. And the purpose is not to ensure that the population has essential supplies required to remain alive, but rather to reduce the availability of essential supplies to them, because the broader objective of Gideon's chariots, as again has been repeatedly and explicitly proclaimed at the highest levels of the Israeli government, is to create the conditions for the mass removal of the Palestinian population of the Gaza Strip outside their homeland. And so they have said, that they intend to physically occupy the entirety of the Gaza Strip for a prolonged period, to create certain what they call sanitized regions and so on. So it's really the final stage of this war of annihilation. I think it was the well-known author Masha Gessen who already in October or perhaps November 2023 pointed out the ghetto is being liquidated, and that is exactly what we're seeing now. This is really the final or penultimate stage of a genocidal military campaign that commenced in late 2023.
Mm. And on that very specific campaign, Israel's finance minister, Smotrich, he said what I found to be one of the most revealing and chilling statements. He said that we are destroying everything that remains in Gaza, and the world isn't going to stop us. And I thought that was revealing, and it's also chilling. And he kind of put out there challenge to the international community. Put aside the US, but everyone else, whoever in London, in Canada, in France, other countries in Europe who are supporting this genocide, has put out a challenge out there. Okay, you're condemning us. Okay, you're denouncing us. Details of which we'll get to later on. But there's nothing you can do about it. We will do what we want, and there's nothing whatsoever that you can do about that. I mean, how did you see that chilling statement by Smotrich?
I see it slightly differently than the way you've expressed it, in the sense that it's a challenge of there's nothing you can do about it. There's a symbiotic relationship between what Israel says and does on the one hand and what its Western sponsors and allies um, don't do on the other. So it's while Smotrich's sentiments and objectives are hardly surprising, the fact that he expresses them so openly, I believe, can only be understood in the context of his supreme and, in my view, justified self-confidence that Israel can do whatever it wants, not because its sponsors and allies can't do anything about it, but because they won't do anything about it. And he speaks with the confidence of experience. For a year and a half, Israel has been perpetrating genocide, and the primary response of the United States, of Great Britain, of Germany, of the European Union has been to supply Israel with ever increasing amounts of weapons, with political support, with vetoes at the UN Security Council, with constant statements about Israel's right and obligation to defend itself, and so on. So I think here again, the spoiled child analogy works very well. Um, the child is only going to run amok in the candy store when it's encouraged to do so by its parents, and the store owner keeps commenting about how cute this kid is who's grabbing whatever he wants. And, with regard to Smotrich personally and many of his peers, when we spoke last week, I thought you used the very appropriate phrase "genocide mania," and that applies, to Smotrich, perhaps more than almost any other of his colleagues. The guy really is not just a genocidal maniac, but he breathes, eats, sleeps, dreams genocide. He's hopelessly addicted to murder, to mass murder, to slaughter, to destruction, to genocide. It's really, I mean, a total psycho, but a totally enabled psycho at the same time.
I think this sense of hubris and being able to get away with it, I
Yes.
think it also plays out in my next story, which is about the trucks that are being delivered, trucks of aid that are being delivered. And in total, something like 8 trucks have been allowed to enter Gaza. I mean, bear in mind, Gaza requires something like 600 trucks per day to meet its basic humanitarian needs, and only 8 have been permitted, from what I've read, 2 of which were really delivering shrouds for people who have been killed and massacred by the Israelis. And if you look at the justification for why this is being done from Netanyahu, he's basically saying that, we're doing this only so that our allies can continue to support us. So just your thoughts on that. I mean, is this anything other than a gimmick to give Israel's allies some wiggle room to continue support the genocide?
Well, I would respond similarly to the way I did to your last question. Um, Netanyahu got up in public and stated basically, this is no more than a PR exercise. telling, the genocide addicts that occupy senior positions in his government, like Smotrich and Ben-Gvir and others, don't worry, it's not like we're actually saving this population from imminent famine. No, we're doing this as a PR exercise in order to relieve um, uh, potential foreign pressure on us to do even more. And again, it requires not only hubris, but confidence in total and complete impunity to be able to say something like this in public. I mean, it would, it's not surprising that Israel is dragging its feet and doing the minimal and really doing this as a PR exercise. But to then get up and boldly state it that don't worry, this is just a few trucks. It's not going to significantly address the situation, but we have to do this as a public relations exercise, really tells you all you need to know. Now, you mentioned the figure of 600 trucks. If I'm not mistaken, under normal circumstances, a minimum of 500 trucks would be required to meet only the minimum needs of the population of the Gaza Strip. But we're now talking about a situation in which absolutely nothing has entered the Gaza Strip since the 2nd of March. So even 500 trucks under the current circumstances would be a drop in the ocean. And what did Israel permit yesterday? 5 trucks. End of story.
Mm. Yeah, so now there has been quite a response to Israel's escalation. And Netanyahu spoke about pressure, and it was pressure that has forced him to allow 8 trucks into the Gaza Strip. And that pressure is partly coming from the US, I guess, but also from the UK, Canada, and France, who issued a joint statement basically saying, Israel has crossed a red line. And they went as far as to say that there will be, and I quote, if Israel does not cease the renewed military offensive and lifts its restrictions, we will take further concrete actions in response. So they mentioned that twice. We will take further concrete actions without specifying what those concrete actions will be. So I mean, when I read that, of course, yes, it's harsher than it normally is, the tone and the language. But isn't this exactly the kind of mealy mouth comments which emboldens the like of Spotrish, and to say things like we are destroying everything that remains in Gaza and the world isn't able to stop us?
Yes, yes, very much so. I mean, one need only compare the response of these countries and their allies in the EU and so on to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, for example, which, regardless of its numerous illegalities and atrocities and so on, no one is even claiming constitutes a genocide. Here you have a genocide that places states and governments under an obligation not only to punish the perpetrators, but to prevent genocide. And what do we have now? A statement by 3 heads of government basically saying 19 months in, I should add, which is not insignificant. If this goes on, there will be consequences, with absolutely no indication of what those consequences may be. And Israel understands better than anyone that this is really a kind of charade, a pantomime. It has no problem with being criticized. It has no problem with being condemned even by its closest allies, because it understands that, certainly at this stage, words are thoroughly meaningless. It is only actions that are relevant. And so to threaten with consequences without indicating what those might be and so on is really meaningless. That's my first observation. My second is that we now have actually a concrete action taken today by the government of Great Britain. Its Foreign Secretary David Lammy speaking to what appears to be a rather disappointed House of Commons, stated that the consequence that the Starmer government is imposing on Israel is to suspend negotiations on a UK-Israeli free trade agreement. Now, it's recently been revealed that British weapons deliveries to Israel increased, I think, threefold, tripled since Starmer came to power. Um, the UK continues to welcome illegal products from illegal settlements in the illegally occupied West Bank and Gaza Strip and Golan Heights. And so the British consequence has been to say, we will continue to give you everything that we're giving you, but we're going to withhold from you something that we haven't given you. I mean, it's a charade. It's an exercise in smoke and mirrors, which that I have to admit the British are quite proficient at, as we've seen over the centuries in multiple locations on the globe. But if these are the consequences, Israel, the message that Israel will receive is keep up the good work. We have your back. Having said that, there, I think, also several interesting aspects here. There has been a clear change of tone, and we're now seeing, for example, the European Union meeting to consider whether or not Israel is violating human rights, which, and, I mean, an absurd premise, but nonetheless, the fact that this meeting is convened, the fact that there is consideration of revoking Israel's preferential trade privileges with the European Union, the fact that at least some governments are proposing that sanctions should be focused not only, on these individual violent settlers, but really on those in power that sponsor and enable them, like government ministers. It's a very clear change in tone, and that explains, I think, why Israel is so alarmed, because it has enjoyed such thorough impunity for so long that even the slightest challenge rings alarm bells in Tel Aviv. And I think what will be most concerning to the Israelis is their fear that these governments are not acting on their own, but as they have done so often in the past, have sought and received permission from Washington to act as they have, because ultimately, the one country that Israel cares for more than any other, more than all the others combined, is the United States. And here it's a little difficult to divine what is happening in Washington because we're hearing so many contradictory reports, but there are indications that Washington's patience with Israel is running low.
Yeah, and we will get to Washington when we review Trump's trip to the Middle East and also revelations of a campaign to kill off pro-Palestinian activism in the US. So we'll get to that. But I want to also get your thoughts on really a great article in the London Review of Books called Starvation in Gaza. We know starvation is being used as a weapon of war by the Israelis. There's been numerous warnings about the famine that's in Gaza as well. And this article goes on to say that Israel's blockade in Gaza is unique in the history of famines, because Palestinians have nowhere to flee. There's no wild food or forage which they can use to survive. And it's a very unique scenario. And then it goes on to explain that Israel's proposal itself is a scheme which is, again, unheard of in history. The very people that are imposing the famine and the starvation are the ones who will be now controlling what goes in, what comes, and what comes out of Gaza.
Yes, there's this article by Alex Duval, one of the world's leading experts on famine and starvation in the context of conflict. It's quite short, but packed with insights and information, as you mentioned, published recently in the London Review of Books. Um, and I'm not sure to what extent what Israel is doing in the Gaza Strip can serve as a template for others, because as Alex Duval points out in this article, what you have in the Gaza Strip is a unique situation where Israel has hermetically sealed off the Gaza Strip from the outside world, where it has destroyed all the agricultural land, where it has prevented the transfer of a single penny of, for example, aid or remittances into the territory from the outside world. And so the Israeli control over the Palestinian population, at least as far as food and nutrition is concerned, is absolute. It is 100%. And he contrasts that with, for example, starvation in, for example, Sudan or Yemen or other countries where population, or at least parts of it, would have access to foraging, would have access to money sent abroad by relatives or whatever. But here, um, the difference is that Israel can ensure that the population literally gets nothing. And that sets it apart from all the other instances of starvation as policy that he's familiar with. So it is a unique situation. And given, how small the Gaza Strip is, how Israel is able to comprehensively control its borders and boundaries, I'm not so sure that it's something that can very easily be replicated elsewhere.
It's a good time to ask about a new study. Researchers from Israel, Holland, the US, UK, Australia, and various other countries have conducted research, and they say that there's the genocide, the Israel's war has reached a level of threshold which meets the criterion for genocide. I mean, I don't think it needs much convincing here. I mean, most people know that, but I guess it adds to the body of evidence of number of experts out there who are now saying that what is happening in Gaza is genocide. When you look at it, look at Israel's policies, clearly you see that there is a deliberate effort to inflict on the Palestinians conditions of life calculated to bring about their physical destruction. That's the definition of genocide. We see that. But I guess this new report adds to the volume of evidence. I mean, what's your thought on the latest report?
Yeah, it's a fascinating report. It's actually a lengthy article originally published in the leading and most prestigious Dutch broadsheet, NRC Handelsblad, and then Middle East Eye and others, I believe Middle East Monitor as well, published a summary of this report in English. And the correspondents interviewed seven of the leading genocide scholars currently working, including a number who are also specifically specialized in the German Holocaust of European Jews during the Second World War. And all of them concluded that the Gaza Strip is currently experiencing a genocide. And they make, and they're quite different. I mean, there was one Israeli scholar who currently works in the United States who came to this conclusion very early on. There's
Raz Siegel.
Yes,
That's
exactly. Ras Siegel, who I think already in October 2023 rang the alarm bells about this. Another said that he initially rejected the finding of genocide, but has since changed his mind. And all of them said that they're not aware of any of their peers who view otherwise. And what was interesting is for some of them, for example, they said what ultimately brought them around to recognizing the reality is when the International Court of Justice, on multiple occasions, issued provisional measures that Israel was required to implement in order to prevent genocide in the Gaza Strip. And Israel not only rejected them and refused to implement a single one, but even intensified its measures in opposition to what the court had ordered. So what you have here is a collection of specialists with different backgrounds who reached the same conclusion over different periods of time for different reasons, but are now unanimous. And they also point out that, genocide is not just a legal finding. In other words, as specialists, they don't need to wait until 2029 for the International Court of Justice to issue a formal ruling because it's a process. And it's looking at the elements of this process that help them reach this conclusion as well. So it's a very interesting, detailed, and I think also compelling exposition of how those who are most familiar with the concept of genocide, who are recognized internationally for their expertise on the crime of crimes, are now unanimous in their view that we don't need to wait for ruling by the International Court of Justice. It already is a genocide. And that creates, again, two obligations, not only punishment, but also prevention.
Hmm. And intent, as we all know, is one of the key
Yes.
components of determining genocide. And the statements that have been issued and are still being issued is clear indication of intent. And one of the clear indication is this effort to drive Palestinians out. And the latest on that is this report that came out recently that the US, along with Israel, are seeking to move 1 million Palestinians into Libya, of all places, war-torn Libya. So first, I mean, if I'm go through the list of countries that had been mooted, we had Egypt first, then Sudan, then Somalia, Rwanda, Chad, Congo, Syria, and now Libya. I mean, how seriously should we take this new plan for ethnic cleansing, which is really part of what genocide is?
Yeah, it reminds me a bit of all the different states and territories that the Zionist movement considered for its ethno-nationalist project before finally settling on Palestine in the late 1890s. But if I could just make one more point about intent with respect to the previous question. I mean, what is notable here is that if you're seeking to demonstrate genocide by mobilizing evidence that Israel is also intentionally carrying out this mass slaughter. What's telling, as we were discussing at the beginning of this discussion, is that statements of intent have, if anything, only become more explicit and more extreme as time has moved on. You would think that as the slaughter intensifies, there would be an effort to hide it or cover it up or, try to paint a pretty face on it. But here, they're now more openly talking about what they're doing and what the objective is than they were previously. And this again relates to hubris and impunity and the confidence that its sponsors and allies have their back and will be prepared to destroy any norm, any international institution, any value in order to ensure that the impunity continues. Now, with respect to your current question, I think the real problem with this proposal of the mass forcible expulsion of Palestinians from the Gaza Strip and potentially, I should add, from the West Bank, and ultimately, if Israel has its way, from within Israel as well. I think that the real issue here is not that the United States and Israel are going to succeed, and all of a sudden we'll wake up tomorrow to find out that Morocco has accepted to receive shiploads of Palestinians. The problem is the way it seeks to legitimize this action, the way that in proposing this, the United States is giving Israel a license to act. Netanyahu this week said that the objective of Gideon's chariots is the implementation of Trump's vision. In other words, he's hiding under Trump's skirts, using that to legitimize the mass expulsion of Palestinians from the Gaza Strip. And the latest incident, as you mentioned, are these reports that the United States has approached Libya. Now, the U.S. Embassy in Tripoli, for quite obvious reasons for those with a memory, has denied that this is the case, but the available reporting indicates that the United States has informed or proposed to the Libyan authorities that if they are prepared to receive, I think, something on the order of 1 million Palestinians from the Gaza Strip, then the United States would work to unfreeze Libyan assets held in various international financial institutions from the period of Muammar al-Gaddafi's rule. So, in other words, these funds that have been frozen now for a decade and a half on account of a leader who is long since dead, buried, and decomposed, the proposal is, we're prepared to bribe you with your own money if you participate in this war crime and crime against humanity.
I mean, there's obviously a reason why all the other countries I mentioned earlier have rejected the idea, and there's no reason why we should believe Libya will also accept this proposal and reject the idea outright. Not to mention the fact that
Can
the
I just add
Palestinian,
add one more point on that,
sure,
if I may, Nassim? I mean, it wasn't so long ago that the Libyan foreign minister met with her Israeli counterpart, and the immediate reaction was that a mob stormed her residence, burned the house down, if I'm not mistaken, and she had to literally flee the country for her life. Now, the idiot who proposes this really thinks he can get Libyan officials to agree not just to meet with an Israeli official, but to make Israel's wet dream of the ethnic cleansing of the Gaza Strip come true. I mean, what planet do these people live on?
yeah, and it goes to what we were saying before. I mean, the idea that this is somehow a humanitarian gesture. This is not humanitarian.
Right.
Every person with an ounce of intelligence knows that this is really about genocide and ethnic cleansing, and none of
Right.
these countries want to be complicit in the genocide and ethnic cleansing. They understand that very well. Um, uh, the next topic I want to get your thoughts on, something we haven't spoken about for a while, but a lot has happened in that arena, which is the ICC. So the chief prosecutor, Karim Khan, had to step aside until this sexual misconduct probe is completed or concluded. Yeah. So I think that was the last we spoke about this issue a few months back. Now there's a new deputy prosecutor, Nazhat Khan, born in Fiji. She will take over. I mean, my initial thought was that the right people have been triggered by that. UN Watch, which is a pro-Israeli outlet, came out immediately and issued a number of tweets condemning her, saying she's corrupt, she's this, she's that.
Oh, good.
Yeah,
So she
yeah.
can't be
So,
done.
yeah. So that was my initial response. There isn't much to go on, and today, Hungarian lawmakers, they've approved a bill to quit the ICC in support of Israel. I mean, do you know, can you just shed a bit more light about the proceedings in the ICC at the moment? Karim Khan's stepping aside and what that means for the arrest warrants issued against Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant and the case that we
Yes.
are familiar with.
So, as you mentioned, the ICC's chief prosecutor, Karim Khan, is facing very, very serious allegations of sexual misconduct and abuse of authority. This came to light some time ago, and he sought to remain in his function while the investigation was pending. There was very strong demands from within the court, from ICC officials and even members of his own staff, that he should at least step aside pending the conclusion of the investigation into these very serious allegations. And he has now taken administrative leave. I think it's quite clear that he was pushed rather than jumped. Unfortunately, he formally he remains the prosecutor because he refused to resign, and therefore his functions are now being exercised by one or two of his deputies. I think there's also another person in addition to the one from Fiji you mentioned. Now, they may well be in a position to better discharge the duties of his office than Khan has been, but they're, I think, institutionally weaker because the ICC is, at least for the time being, functioning without an elected prosecutor. Now, more recently, there have been revelations that Khan timed um, uh, the his application for arrest warrants of two Israeli and three Palestinian leaders in order to divert attention from the gathering allegations against him. And he did this hoping that it would nip the story in the bud. And so, of course, immediately the Hasbara Symphony Orchestra, led by Israel flunkies like UN Watch and others, have used these revelations to, in their view, determine that the entire case against Netanyahu and Gallant is a sham, that the only reason this even exists is because Khan was seeking to escape culpability for his alleged crimes, and that therefore this whole case now should be dismissed. Well, I mean, if you look at it in a little more detail, it actually makes the opposite point, because without getting into all the nuts and bolts of this, Khan has been instrumental in shielding Israel from accountability by the International Criminal Court. He has been dragging his feet for years in order to prevent the situation that now exists. And in fact, he forced his own hand by first initiating a investigation into the situation in Ukraine, which a year later made it more difficult for him to continue ignoring the situation in Palestine. And secondly, the Israelis, through their conduct, made it difficult for him to ignore what's going on. And thirdly, he was facing growing pressure from within the ICC itself, by its staff, by its officials, by its investigators, that he can no longer ignore the situation in Palestine. And so, if he did indeed determine the precise timing of his applications for these arrest warrants, I think the more important background element is that the only reason he was able to do so is because he was able to prevent these applications from going out months, if not years earlier, when any competent and professional prosecutor would have done so. Now, there's a second and equally important element, is that the decision to issue arrest warrants for Netanyahu and Gallant was not a personal decision by Karim Khan. It was based on the hard work and investigations by an entire staff working for the International Criminal Court. And once Karim Khan was left with no choice but to apply for an arrest warrant. It wasn't him who issued it. He had to apply to what is known as a pretrial chamber, a panel of 3 judges who had to assess the evidence and determine whether there was sufficient grounds to issue the arrest warrant. And these people who conduct their duties independently of Khan came to the conclusion that the evidence was overwhelming, and it was on that basis that the arrest warrants were issued, rather than Khan making this determination all by himself.
Of course, we'll follow that story. And I want to return to a story we were discussing last week, which is the release of the American Israeli soldier by Hamas last week, Eden Alexander. So now there's been reports that he was released as part of a good faith initiative to start negotiations with the US. And Steve Witkoff apparently personally promised to lift the Gaza blockade in exchange for his release. And his release, of course, came, I think, just a day before Trump visited Saudi Arabia. Now there's talks that Hamas have actually been played, because instead of lifting the blockade and ending the war, what we've seen is Israel escalate and launched its new offensive on Gaza. I mean, what do you know about this story, and whether Hamas has actually been played, and whether the US did actually promise to lift the blockade and end the war in exchange for the release of Eden Alexander? I mean, one might think, US could have been quite crafty here. They made a deal to get him released. Trump can now show that he's got this prize on behalf of the American population. He got the release, or secured the release, of Eden Alexander, and now opened the way for Israel to go and carry out whatever massacre and killings it wants to carry out in Gaza. I mean, that's a story that Trump can sell in a compelling way. So, I mean, what do we know about this?
Yes, I mean the background here is that this Israeli soldier, who's also a dual U.S. citizen, was released on the eve of Trump's recent visit to the Persian Gulf states. And Hamas at the time described it as a goodwill gesture. The Americans, in their own statement, said that they neither offered nor provided anything in return. Now, those statements together mean that mean that there was no formal agreement for that committed the United States to anything. So, to that extent, if Hamas got played, it played itself rather than getting played by the Americans. Now, whether the Americans wanted the soldier released from captivity basically as a PR exercise on the eve of Trump's visit to the Middle East, or whether they felt they needed to get this American citizen out of harm's way before Israel began its intensified military assault on the Gaza Strip, or both, we don't know. But Hamas is now claiming that in exchange for releasing this captive, it received informal assurances from the United States that they would ensure that Israel would allow aid into the humanitarian supplies into the Gaza Strip. I mean, we can't know with certainty. It's certainly plausible, and it's certainly plausible that the Americans either never meant it to begin with, or that they did propose this to the Israelis, but without exercising sufficient pressure, and the Israelis refused to respond positively. And it's also possible that these revelations, along with the massive demonstrations we've seen in Europe during the past week, 100,000 in Holland, reportedly 500,000 in London, and so on, along with statements such as those by Smotrich, which have left his closest allies with very little wiggle room, that these factors altogether combined to account for the developments we've seen in the past few days. I mean, we're talking about, I think, a very murky area where Hamas's claim that there was an informal agreement means that there is no document on which we can assess the veracity of its claims at the end of the day.
Mm. And sticking to Trump's tour of the Middle East, I mean, just what did you make of that? I mean, of course, he secured trillions of dollars worth of investment in the US from Saudi Arabia, from the UAE, and from Qatar. And obvious, obvious question many would ask or contemplate is, whether those trillions of investment were somehow conditioned on ending the genocide in their doorsteps. I mean, is that something that would have actually um, been presented in front of Trump? I don't know. I doubt very much that they would have done that. Well, at least, I mean, when they are discussing Palestine in this kind of context, I mean, there is an offer on the table for the Israelis, which is that end the war, the hostages will be released, and even countries like the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar, they will pay for the redevelopment of Gaza on the condition that Israel ends its war, withdraws its troops. So that's an offer on the table. And instead of that offer, Israel has chosen to continue its genocide and isolate itself in the eyes of the international community. And then when you see those two options playing out, you think, one's a no-brainer, let the Arab countries deal with this. Let's withdraw. Let's give Gaza back to the Palestinians, and the Arab countries will develop and build Gaza. But Israel, for various reasons, has opted for the other one. I just find that quite extraordinary. But going back to the Trump's tour of the Middle East, I mean, just your general thoughts on that and the investment which they have pledged, and whether you think they would have made any demands on Trump to condition their investment on ending the genocide in their doorstep.
Demands and conditionality, absolutely no. That's clear as daylight. Look, I think Trump's visit was significant because traditionally the U.S. coordinates its Middle East policy with Israel, or it incorporates Israel's agenda and priorities into its own, and at times will even subordinate its own interests to those of Israel. We now have a somewhat different paradigm where the United States is pursuing relations with the region and with states and governments in the region bilaterally without reference to Israel. Now, Saudi Arabia is a perfect example. Under Biden, a U.S. Saudi agreement was made conditional on Saudi-Israeli normalization. And when Israel was unprepared to deliver its commitments that would be required for normalization, um, nothing happened. Now Trump comes along. His priorities are the U.S. economy and the global position of the U.S. economy. And he basically told the Israelis to take a hike. I'm not going to wait for you. If you're not on board, I'm going to move ahead and make a bilateral deal with the Saudis. Now, something that had been perceived as entirely conditional on Saudi-Israeli normalization, that normalization has now become fundamentally irrelevant to the intensification of U.S. Saudi relations. We see the same with Iran. We see the same with Syria, where Israel had been agitating for the maintenance of sanctions. We see the same in Yemen, where the U.S. actually signed a deal with the Houthis that permits them to continue attacking Israel without any consequences from the US. And we even see this with Hamas in terms of the US going over Israel's head and negotiating indirectly with Hamas in order to achieve the release of this captive. So, in that sense, it's very significant. And I think from the perspective of the states that he visited, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the UAE, they are also primarily invested in their bilateral relations with the US. To the extent that regional issues were a concern, I think the two most obvious ones were Syria, where there was where there was, I wouldn't call it pressure, but removing sanctions on Syria was very much on the agenda of these states because they don't want that country to disintegrate and with regional fallout, as we saw in Iraq after 2003. And secondly, that they were all strongly encouraging Trump to continue with the nuclear negotiations with Iran and reach a deal because the alternative that Israel is constantly um, uh, pushing for is to blow up the entire region, which could have untold consequences for these states. Now, was Palestine, Gaza, a prominent item on the agenda of their discussions with the United States? I've seen no indication that it was. But having said that, Qatar is, of course, one of the mediators in Gaza, so it must have come up in discussion. But the idea that these states, even for a millisecond, considered conditioning any of their commitments towards the United States on a change in U.S. policy towards Palestine, no, that simply did not happen.
Yeah, and what's
And sorry,
interesting,
if I may,
sorry,
if
go
I
on.
should add, the figure that's being touted is $1 trillion in investments. Um, this is massive hype. I can't imagine the circumstances under which even half that amount ultimately ends up either invested in the U.S. or used to purchase U.S. goods.
Yes, that's Trump
Mm.
hyperbole, I guess,
Well,
trying to,
it's hype by all concerned, I should add.
yeah. And what was interesting, I mean, Trump was so friendly towards Qatar, the Qatari Emir Al-Thani. While that's going on, the Israeli Prime Minister and his Likud party have submitted a bill to the Knesset seeking to bar Qatar from any mediation, any negotiation. And at the same time, there's a real concerted effort in the US to present Qatar as a supporter of terrorism. Um, so I just find that quite odd because you have on the one hand Trump, who's taken a very cordial relationship towards Qatar, but at the same time, here again, there's I guess, another disagreement between the Americans and the Israelis, which is over Qatar. As I mentioned, Trump taking cordial relationship with Qatar, but at the same time, the Israelis are becoming, well, seeming to at least, becoming more and more hostile, and now submitting bills to prevent Qatar from any kind of
Mm.
mediation and describe Qatar as a state sponsor of terrorism. And the whole pro-Israeli Zionist ecosystem that is in the US and elsewhere, they are now targeting Qatar as some funder of terrorism around the world. And that's so I see that contrast, quite a interesting development that's taking shape.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, the Israel lobby is trying to manufacture this righteous outrage that another foreign state may be trying to seek influence in Washington, as if, God forbid that this should ever happen. Look, it's how the United States works. If you want influence in the United States, you pay for it. It's what every other country does. And as we've now learned with Trump's recent visit to the Middle East, U.S. foreign policy is for sale to the highest bidder. Um, these rules weren't established by Qatar. They weren't established by Israel. They were established by the U.S. elites. And I think part of it is Israeli envy that others are now finally learning how to play this game, and in some respects, playing this game more effectively than Israel. But you know, are university professors being fired, or are U.S. college students being sent to the swamps of Louisiana to be locked up because they're criticizing Qatar? You know, are people being deported and losing their visas because they're criticizing Qatar? No. You know, if you really want to cross the line in the US, you can criticize Qatar all you want. You can criticize the United States all you want, but hands off Israel.
And that is the test, I guess, and which takes me to the final question for this episode, which is no, there's an effort by Trump's backers to stigmatize, criminalize pro-Palestinian activism, and and you see this in a new blueprint that was revealed by the New York Times. And the individuals behind the initiative is called Project 2025. They're the organizations, a number of organizations that are trying to push America more towards the right wing and change American politics for the foreseeable future. And they've come out with an initiative called Project Esther to basically kill off any kind of pro-Palestinian activism in the US. And this is being done in conjunction with Israel. So to talk about
Yes.
Qatar's influence, here you have one of many examples of US and the Israeli collaborating to crack down on US campuses, US students, and everything we've seen over the past few months with the stripping of visas, with expulsion of students from the US, and also cutting funds to American universities. This is all part of this initiative to kill pro-Palestinian activism in Washington. So I mean, just your thoughts on that, but also on other censorship I should mention. I mean, here in the UK, Gary Lineker has left the
Yeah.
BBC partly because of his stance on Palestine, and I guess we can also cite a number of other examples, like the BBC documentary. There's a really important documentary exposing Israel's targeting of hospitals. The BBC has been sitting on this for a number of weeks. Just the other day, the producers of this documentary have come out and said that it's very unlikely that this documentary will be shown on the BBC. They will now look to find other ways of showing or airing this documentary. So there's a crackdown that's taking place across all allies of Israel, and I guess the most sinister one is the one which I mentioned, which is Operation. Um, sorry, I forget the name
Project
of the
Esther.
Project Esther. Sorry.
Well, let's start with that documentary first. I mean, you know, the only analogy that comes to mind at the moment is from the late 1970s when the BBC produced a documentary entitled Death of a Princess about the execution of a Saudi royal princess. And the BBC and the British government came under massive pressure directly from the Saudi government. I think at one point there were even suggestions or threats made about an oil boycott if the BBC went ahead and showed this video, and it didn't buckle, and and they showed they broadcast the documentary, and lo and behold, the next morning the sun still rose in the east, and life continued. Contrast it with today, where these terrified cowards and Israel flunkies who are today in charge of the BBC won't even consider broadcasting a documentary that they themselves commissioned about the destruction of the health sector in the Gaza Strip by Israel in the context of a genocide. And they have basically, you know, decided to bury it in some file. And then Gary Lineker. I mean, Gary Lineker's crime is that he reposted a video segment, which was the noted Palestinian advocate Diana Buttu talking about the current situation, and it had a small rat emoji. The person who made this video had placed a rat emoji in it. He didn't realize that it had a rat emoji. I should say I watched this video and I kept waiting, you know, for this rat emoji to come up and dominate the screen. And only later did I realize it was in the upper left-hand corner. So it's in, you know, there's absolutely no doubt, no reason to doubt Gary Lineker's explanation that he hadn't seen the rat emoji. Not only that, once he realized this, when it was pointed out to him, not only did he delete the post, but unlike any Israel flunky, he actually apologized for having posted it in the first place. Nevertheless, that, it turns out, is a fireable offense. You know, when is the last time anyone has, if Gary Lineker had expressed similar sentiment or the sentiments that he's accused of towards Palestinians or towards Arabs or towards Muslims, and dug in his heels when confronted about them, do you really think he would have been forced to leave the BBC? Absolutely not. He would still be sitting pretty. So this idea, you know, the whole world is against us, and all the rest of it, it's just pure nonsense. It's a reign of intellectual terror in which these ever more outrageous accusations are being used, and they're going precisely after people like Gary Lineker, because the message is, if we can get him, we can get anybody.
Hmm. And just commenting on Project Esther,
Yes. So,
now, before you do that, I wanted to read out a tweet by the head of the World Zionist Congress, because what we're describing is only going to get worse. His name is Ronald Lauder, and he says in a tweet this morning, I saw, okay, and I'll read it out. I mean, it's worth listening to. Just as Israel failed to anticipate Hamas's surprise assault, we failed to anticipate the all-out offensive on the mindset of the free world. Because of this, Israel didn't just suffer the attack on October 7th, the entire Jewish world was attacked on October 8th. And this is the important bit. He says, what is needed now is a new project for the Jewish people, one that educates millions of children, Jewish and non-Jewish alike. We must go school by school to remove anti-Israel and anti-Semitic teachers and administrators. This will not be easy, but we, the World Jewish Congress, will be able to do it. I mean, it's chilling statement, and looking at what we are seeing at the moment, university lecturers being kicked out of their job, students being pulled off the streets, and when you hear someone of his caliber issuing tweets like that, you think, you know, this is only going to get worse. The
yeah,
crackdown on pro-Palestinian activism is going to be really, really bad.
well, your dystopia is his utopia. You know, it's um, he's obviously never heard of Project Esther, which is openly proclaiming itself as a project to crush, eradicate, and eliminate any criticism of Israel and any support for the Palestinians in the United States. It's explicit about this, and it's not insignificant because it comes from the Heritage Foundation, which is the same foundation that published Project 2025, whose workings we are seeing now so clearly under the Trump administration. But again, these are the same people who were whining about the influence of Qatar and China and who knows who else in the U.S. And with a straight face, they will complain about this while their project is to literally criminalize, eradicate, eliminate any criticism, even any discussion of their favorite state. They have already succeeded in transforming the United States into a country where there is more tolerance for criticism and condemnation of the United States than there is of Israel. It just blows the mind.
Thank you, Moin. We've come to the end of our episode. As always, it's a
Thank
real
you.
pleasure to have you on the show. That was my guest, Mouin Rabbani, and this was Palestine This Week with me, Nassim Ahmed. See you next week for another episode of Palestine This Week. Bye-bye.